Good afternoon. It's a pleasure welcoming Dr. Irfanullah Farooqi again for a session on education and dialogue, lessons from Gandhi and Tagore. You all know Dr. Farooqi already, but for the record, let me introduce him. Um, Irfanullah Farooqi is currently working as an assistant professor, Department of Sociology, uh, South Asian University. Prior to joining SAU, he worked at the Department of Sociology, Aligarh Muslim University, and Jamia Millia Islamia. As a result of his MPhil on Faiz and PhD on Muhammad Iqbal, he has developed a keen interest in the meeting point of sociology, literature, and history. Currently, he finds himself inclined towards Islam and Muslims in South Asia, Urdu Studies, South Asian social thought, sociology of literature, and sociology of education. As of now, he is interested in university-nation interface, academic freedom, secular religious exchange, media culture dynamics, and questions related to identity. You're welcome, Dr. Farooqi. You have up to 3 hours for this session, and you're welcome to conduct it however you like to. So with you, sir.
Okay, thank you, Bezad. No, I'm afraid I won't take 3 hours. That's a little intimidating. But uh, yeah, thank you everyone for being here. It's been a while. I hope all of you are doing all right. These are times of, uh, shall I say, stunning uncertainty, striking uncertainty. So today, as you know already, this is a session where I try and discuss, of course, in a very elementary fashion, education and slash as dialogue and lessons from Tagore and Gandhi, Gandhi and Tagore. Now, I must at the outset, make a confession. I think it's important to start any conversation, any exchange with confessions and disclaimers. Uh, See, the point is that whether it's Gandhi or Tagore, these luminaries, I mean, the kind of contribution they have made, the kind of literature they have produced is colossal, to say the least. Uh, and it's absolutely impossible for anyone to talk about just one of these in a span of even 3 hours. So people essentially conduct, summer schools, winter schools on their philosophy, and they go on for 15 days, a month, and yet the participants remain, quote unquote, uninformed. So of course, in the next hour or so, my intention, my aim is far more modest. I simply want to draw our attention to some of the important concerns that are raised by Gandhi and Tagore in the context of education. If we are looking at education as dialogue, right? So it is not to say that it will be an exceptionally comprehensive or an exhaustive summarizing of what these two great minds have to say on education specifically. But I would just flag, as I said, I'll just flag the important points that have been marked, raised, flagged, etc. I also want to, at the outset, share with you how is it structured. So what I'll do is I'll start with you know some sort of a set of remarks on education and dialogue and education as dialogue, and this is uh, with the intention that it'll do a bit of landscaping. So we try and understand how has education been looked at from the vantage point of its relationship with dialogue and as dialogue, more importantly. And then once that bit is taken care of, then we enter into the world of Gandhi and Tagore uh, in that sequence and try and see how do these great minds talk about education as dialogue, and how do they essentially inform us about a very different understanding of dialogue. And off and on, I'll also try and give examples from everyday life, and hopefully they will help us understand what Gandhi and Tagore are up to, or the ambition that they have as they write some of these seminal lines on education as dialogue, right? So, for instance, if we start with the first part of this presentation, a general reflection on education and slash as dialogue. We know very well, and I don't necessarily have to say this, that education can mean a range of things, right? I mean, although we tend to use it as if it is altogether deprived of, or it is altogether clean of any ambiguity. But the fact of the matter is that education is actually used in a range of ways. So, for instance, when we say well educated, we are not necessarily reflecting on just an institutional affiliation or a certain trajectory, but we are actually hinting at something more than that as well. When we're talking about adult education, when we're talking about educating children, and when we, bring in other constructs, for instance, moral, political, cultural, etc., we religious, then we are hinting at, or we are signaling a very different take on education. So, needless to say, it's a fairly broad spectrum with many shades. Uh, and education has concerned many of us for a very long time because it plays supposedly, it plays a very important role in the workings of the social life. It plays an exceptionally important role in how social life will unfold itself, right? So there's something very central about education. There's something very critical about education, and therefore, a lot of people reflected on what education is and how it can, contribute to, or how it can be better. What is it that we can think about in terms of ideals of education, etc. So this is something, as some of you would already know, this is something that was broadly taken into account in the subfield called philosophy of education, where you have a range of scholars reflecting on what education means and what it can do, etc., etc. Now, one thing that we perhaps need to understand before we go any further is that there is something called the essence of education, and then there is something called technicalities of education. So, unfortunately, in the times we live in, the technicalities of education take over, or let's say they outdo the essence, the intrinsic value of education. So, when I say technicalities of education, what is it that I mean? You think about our institutions, you think about universities, schools, colleges, what is it that is really, really emphasized on? So, for the most part, the administration is hell-bent upon the timetable, right? It's hell-bent upon a certain kind of punctuality. Now, I'm not at all pointing out that these are things that are not important. Of course, the timetable is very, very important. And if we do not stick to the timetable, then of course there is chaos. There's a certain kind of disorder in the overall landscape. But what is important to remember is that education is not merely a timetable slot, right? Education is not just about starting a class at a certain point and ending the class at another point. So, for instance, let's say I am the director of an organization, or let's say I am the vice chancellor, and I go to, let's say, and this used to happen very often in Aligarh. So the vice chancellor early in the morning would just, would step out of his office, and it was some sort of a raid. One could call it a raid. So he would just enter any of the classroom, and he would carry the timetable with him. And all he was concerned about was that, the class is supposed to start at 8 o'clock and go on till 8:55, whether the teacher entered the class at 8 o'clock sharp or not, and did he leave at 8:55 or before 8:55, right? Now, technically speaking, these are important concerns. I'm not denying the importance of these concerns, but the fact of the matter is that we all know that, education is not just about entering, doing something and leaving. It's not just about marking attendance. It's not just about taking care of a certain lesson. But there is something else that education, in fact, this something else is everything about education. And the technicalities is more of a peripheral concern, right? And it is in this regard that many scholars started talking about purpose of education. What exactly is the purpose of education? What are the aims of education? What is it that education strives for? Now, when these philosophers were talking about aims, they were not necessarily looking at aims the way we look at aims nowadays in a market driven neoliberal economy. Because here in our lives, aims are very tentative, aims are very immediate, aims are very instrumental. But when these great philosophers, thinkers, so for instance, when people like Rousseau, John Dewey, Michael Apple, Louis Althusser, many other writers, Tolstoy, Gandhi, Tagore, Krishnamurti, etc., when they were talking about aims of education, they were essentially looking at something much higher. They were looking at something that is beyond the dictates of the market. And in that sense, the question was, can education really have the kind of aims that we think it should have, right? And then the philosophers pointed out that, if we are thinking about education only in terms of aims, then what we are doing is we are actually confusing, or let's say, I wouldn't say confusing. Let's say we are considering education as something that is synonymous to schooling. And the philosophers were very clear that education is not necessarily schooling. Schooling is more driven by a certain principle of socialization. Schooling can also be informed by a certain logic of indoctrination. So philosophers were very clear that if you are hell-bent upon a set of aims for education, then maybe what we are doing is we are kind of considering education as schooling. But the fact of the matter is that education is more than schooling, and which is why a great deal has been written on deschooling. For instance, the great critic, writer Ivan Illich's famous work, Deschooling Society, is actually a critique of a very formalized, indoctrination-driven education. Anyways, so schooling and education. So philosophers of education were also very clear that schooling and education are two different things, or at least they should not be treated as synonymous, because schooling very often can actually give way to what they call indoctrination, and this is something that we all know, right? Once in a while, this indoctrination is euphemistically put as socialization, but the fact of the matter is that schooling does lead to a certain kind of indoctrination, which is a subtle way, it's slightly subtle version, which is socialization, and they're both not so acceptable. I mean, indoctrination definitely not acceptable. Socialization as well, once in a while, can be very, very problematic, particularly for a society that truly aspires for a democratic and just learning. So it is in this context that scholars talked about deschooling society, etc. Now, with this in the background, people were talking about dialogue in education, right? So this is the reason why dialogue in education became such an important aspect. It became such an important reference, that if you really want to do something about education in a way that it does not get appropriated, in a way that it doesn't really become indoctrination or socialization, then we need to do something about it by means of dialogue, right? So that there be dialogue in education. And when people made a case for dialogue in education, or let's say education and dialogue, what they were talking about was, they were critiquing or they were questioning something called mindless repetition, right? Something with which we've all grown up with. I mean, I can't really say about you, but I definitely did schooling, which was all about repetition. It was all about going through the same set of lessons again and again, and in a certain sense, rote learning was incentivized, right? So those of us who could exactly repeat what the teacher had said or what the teacher had shared, we ended up topping the class. And now when we think about it retrospectively, we realize that what a tragedy it was during our growing up years, etc. So rote learning is something that was questioned, mindless repetition was questioned, and a certain kind of power relations that enter teacher-student exchange, right? So when people were talking about education and dialogue, these were the things that were primarily looked at, and these were the things that, in a certain sense, warranted revision or reconceptualization. So it was a very critical development, and it was a very, very important intervention, needless to say. And dialogue was brought in, and I need not educate you guys on dialogue because you've been listening to great scholars on dialogue for a while now. But dialogue was actually brought into this picture because we have off late come to a situation, we have off late entered a world where we've kind of realized there seems to be a social consensus on this, that it is, I mean, it's always better to reach a decision through dialogue rather than through force or through deception or through some other means. So I think there seems to be a certain consensus as far as our collective life, as far as the overall society within which we live is concerned. There seems to be a certain consensus that arriving at something through dialogue is any day a better option, in fact, a far better option as compared to arriving at something by means of war, by means of coercion, by means of force, by means of deception, etc., etc. So therefore, dialogue was to play a very important role. But then what happens is, so this is education and dialogue. But when you say education as dialogue, what we are essentially doing is we are taking it a step further. We are making it radically democratic, right? We are making it radically progressive. So education as dialogue is something that kind of helps us understand, truly speaking, uh, the intrinsic value of education. What exactly education is, the essence of it. And this is why many scholars have pointed out that education as dialogue is in many ways our best foot forward to check indoctrination in its tracks. Right? That is the only way in which one can check indoctrination, one can check all kinds of non democratic, dictatorial aspirations within the domain of education, authoritarian, dictatorial aspirations within the domain of education. So, education and dialogue, a wonderful initiative, a wonderful intervention, a very important intervention. But education as dialogue actually take things further and tries to make it much more democratic, much more radical. And it is in this context that once again, dialogue was looked at as something that played a very important role in understanding selfhood or in the development of the self, right? So, for instance, selfhood as something that was emerging through dialogue, where one becomes aware or one becomes or acquires, an understanding of oneself only through knowing the other, right? So dialogue in that sense became a very important phenomenon, and education became an interface of knowing, right? And knowing the other. But it was also about education as something that hinted at being present, right? And education is not something that was only received passively, but something that implied being present in the moment and being present to a separate, distinct other. This is something that in dialogue as well we talk about, being present to a separate, distinct other, and but being present with a sense of trust, with a sense of confidence, with a sense of hope and faith, etc. Now, when you have this kind of a situation, that is when, as scholars have drawn our attention to, education truly becomes a dialogue, right? And in fact, we've been told that education is a pure dialogue. If you actually get into the intrinsic value of education, what you realize in no time is that education is purely a dialogue and nothing else. So dialogue involves being present to a separate and distinct other in trust that he or she too has a particular contribution to add to the world. Now, if you take this and you implant it, you use it in the domain of education, this is precisely when education is a dialogue, or education as dialogue can be understood. Because in a way, what we are doing is we are actually allowing ourselves, and it's a phenomenal statement, allowing oneself to be met, right? This is something that Martin Buber, in one of his lectures on education, talked about, allowing ourselves to be met. This is something that dialogue does, right? And education as dialogue is essentially to be understood from this very, very phenomenal, shall I say, phrasing, allowing ourselves to be met. And lastly, in this whole context, uh, it is when we are talking about education as dialogue, we are also trying to make a distinction between what is called being and seeming, right? So being an individual and seeming as an individual, instead of being and appearing, these are two different things. For instance, in the writings of one of the Marxist writers, there's a very interesting distinction between what he calls essence and appearance, right? And I think here as well, to a certain extent, we are operating along similar lines. And it has been pointed out, and this was essentially pointed out by Martin Buber, the famous Jewish philosopher, writer. Oh, he delivered a lecture in the year 1925, and this was at Heidelberg, and the occasion was, I suppose, international conference, educational conference. And he was addressing a lot of people who were back then quite concerned about, particularly children's education. And Buber was speaking on education. And in this particular lecture, he talked about a range of things. But one of the things that he talked about extensively was this distinction between being and seeming. And he said quite categorically that the teacher should not seem to be someone. The teacher has to be who he or she is, because only then, truly speaking, dialogue can happen. So if you're constantly pretending to be someone else, if you're projecting yourself as someone you're not, then no matter what you do, no matter how charismatic you are as a pedagogue, truly speaking, dialogue will not take place. So Buber was essentially pointing out something very critical in terms of education as dialogue. And in that sense, education was then pitched as something that has to do with our growing capacity to know and to be known by the other. Right? So a growing capacity. So being educated means, having this capacity to know ourselves, and more importantly, our capacity to be known by the other, right? And of course, to be known by the other is always much more demanding. There are always guards, and we always make sure that we are guarded. It's not easy to let someone else know us, right? But this is where education as dialogue becomes very, very crucial. So so far what I've pointed out kind of helps us understand that education is, to go back to Buber, pure dialogue, right? There is just nothing else that could be brought to education more in a more discerning way. Education is, truly speaking, in the ideal situation, education is pure dialogue. And it is in this case that, role of dialogue can be looked at in different aspects of teaching and learning. We can look at the meaning of dialogue in creativity. We can talk about freedom as a precondition of dialogue. We can talk about knowledge as not just about acquisition, but a certain kind of relatedness, or something that signals a certain relationship of the teacher to the student, etc. So this is what we have now. When we move on to the likes of Gandhi and Tagore, we are, of course, all of this is in the background. I don't think either Gandhi or Tagore moves away from or deviates or kind of charts a different trajectory. But what Gandhi and Tagore essentially do in their respective, in their writings, in their reflections, and in their everyday practice vis-a-vis education, is that they kind of bring to our notice a slightly different, or let's say a more advanced understanding of dialogue, and particularly from the vantage point of Indian society. So what they are doing in their engagement with education, in their reflections on education, and more importantly, in their everyday practice vis-a-vis education, what they are doing is they are essentially introducing us to finer aspects of dialogue, and and they also introduce us to how one can always push education as dialogue further, depending on the situation on the ground. So theirs is a quintessentially Indian, in that sense, response, which very much caters to the dynamics of Indian society. So they, in many ways, they push our horizons of understanding and comprehension further, specifically speaking with reference to education as dialogue. Now, the second part, which is Gandhi on education, what is it that we can take from Gandhi? As some of you, or perhaps all of you, would know, Gandhi has a very has a distinct position in relation to colonialism, modernity, etc. So those of us who've read Hind Swaraj would know very well that Gandhi's politics was centered around the idea of self, right? So, for instance, when he talks about, Swaraj, for instance, the idea of Swaraj itself, A lot of times it's kind of instantly translated as self-rule, self-rule, right? Self-rule, that's what it is. And even when the Congress was sort of advocating Swaraj, and a lot of other people were advocating Swaraj, this is precisely what they meant. A little before this, the early years of Congress, it meant home rule. We know very well that the first generation of congressmen were more interested in representation in the Imperial Council. But as we move along and as Gandhi enters the scene, the demands actually evolve, and then they're talking about self rule. But Gandhi is not really talking about self rule. If you read Hind Swaraj from cover to cover, if you read Hind Swaraj line after line, paragraph after paragraph, one thing that comes out very clearly is that Gandhi is talking about not self rule, but more importantly, rule over the self. So, for instance, for Gandhi, if we are able to control ourselves, right, if we are able to rule ourselves, then colonialism becomes not so important, or let's say becomes absolutely unimportant. So, in other words, if we can control our own desires, then we are actually speaking free. And free individuals cannot be enslaved. Of course, there is more to it, but I just wanted to point this out that for Gandhi, the entire politics around decolonization is centered on the question of self, right? You take the question of self out, and Gandhi's entire corpus collapses. There's nothing left in Gandhi's writings on anything. Whatever Gandhi approaches, whether it's the question of religion or the question of nation or the question of art or the question of education, Gandhi is always starting from and ending at self, right? So self is the site where everything is happening for Gandhi. So Gandhi, as I just pointed out, that he made this case for a self that is in control, because a self that is not under control is essentially not something that Gandhi is in favor of. So, for instance, a simple argument would be that even if the British were to leave India, but but ourselves were not under our control, then freedom does not necessarily mean anything, because end of the day we are under control of something. And on the other hand, if we are able to free ourselves from the self, and if we are able to take control of our desires, then what happens is whether the British are here or they're not here, it does not really matter, because temperamentally, intrinsically, we are free individuals, because we have managed to control our desires, we have managed to control ourselves, etc. Now, with this as the background, we know very well, and I just want to point this out, that Gandhi's take on education cannot be dissociated from his take on self. So, therefore, I don't think I need to point this out, that when Gandhi is talking about education, he is essentially talking about the need for a self reliant self, or the need for an independent, under control, in check self, right? That's what education for Gandhi is, or that's what education for Gandhi should do. Now, Gandhi was, of course, Gandhi started writing on education way back, I think, way before he even entered, the Indian politics. When he started Tolstoy form in South Africa, that is when he started experimenting and talking about education. And he borrowed extensively from the likes of John Ruskin, Thoreau, and of course Tolstoy. But one thing that Gandhi was very clear about was that, our take, he always maintained that our take on education cannot be dissociated. Our take on education cannot be dissociated from our take on the human being and human society. So, how do we conceptualize the human? For this is the word man to for the kind of society we strive for, in a way, will tell us about what exactly do we expect from education, or what kind of education we want for ourselves. So, right, so this is the start point. Now, Gandhi was quite clear, and some of you would know this, that back in the 19th century, Macaulay's famous Minutes on Indian Education, where he talked about the need for interlocutors or intermediaries, where he simply said that we need to have English education in India so that we can create a breed of or a mass of Indians who look like Indians but who think like British, right? Whose opinions and tastes are British, whose appearance is Indian. So that's precisely what Macaulay had. Gandhi is very clear. He says that, if you think about English education, what has it done? It has essentially produced only clerks and interpreters. And he was quite right. I think the man had his diagnosis in place, that English education ended up producing only clerks, right? And these were the people who were essentially the cogs in the larger colonial machinery. And interpreters, right? So clerks and interpreters. So this is what Gandhi points out. And then he says that, there's been a severe damage as a result of understanding education simply as English education, right? Education is not necessarily just English education. And I suppose it still plagues us. If you think about some of our elderly relatives or not just elderly relatives, but I think some of our contemporaries as well, who think that if someone is able to speak eloquently in English, he or she is well educated, right? So very often we do not associate education with the vernacular. So someone who's good in Hindi, or someone who's good in Gujarati, or someone who's good in Uriya language or Telugu, might not immediately strike as a well-educated person. So we very often, unfortunately, tragically so, we very often associate English speaking with education. So something that Gandhi was pointing out more than 125 years ago, it seems that still plagues us. So English education has simply given us clerks and interpreters, and there is serious issue with understanding education as English education. Gandhi also pointed out that it is so unfortunate that Congress sessions were in English. Congress claimed to be a party that represented India, but Gandhi's simple question was that, does India really, or do Indians at large, or do majority of Indians understand English? And therefore, the question, very, very pertinent question. So, and Gandhi also pointed out that most of our newspapers are also in English. The best newspapers are in English. And this led to this very fundamental question: what kind of society? And this is a question that Gandhi was, I think, occupied with throughout his life, till the time he breathed his last. What kind of society and human beings do we cherish, right? As individuals, we must ask ourselves, what kind of a society or what kind of a human being do we cherish? And this question is directly associated with what kind of education we wish for ourselves. These two questions cannot be separated from each other. They are inextricably linked with each other. So what he was trying to point out was that perhaps we are aspiring for a very different kind of society and a very different kind of human being, which is why our take on education is very different, right? Our take on education is kind of, according to Gandhi, is very problematic. And it is in this context that Gandhi pitches his understanding of education. And he says that education ought to be used for controlling of senses. He's going back to what remains a fundamental aspect of his thought: controlling of senses. A person who is in control of his senses is, truly speaking, an educated man. So, and he says that so far, when he's reflecting on these things in the 1890s, early 20th century, he says so far education has not really enabled us to do our duty. What is our duty? The duty is to control our senses. And if we are able to control our senses, what will happen automatically is what he calls character building. And according to Gandhi, primary education is character building. Primary education is not, elementary mathematics, language, etc., reading, writing. That is not primary. Primary for Gandhi is character building. And here he's also questioning something that will also come out in Tagore in a very different way, though. he's also questioning English education or modern education as something that is preoccupied with the mental, right? So Gandhi says that here is an education that only talks about or only concerns itself with the mental, with the intellectual. But Gandhi believes that, there are other aspects of human beings as well. We have the spiritual side, we have the physical side, we have the body, we have mind, we have soul, and we have a certain sense of spirit, but definitely body, mind, soul. And Gandhi says that, body, mind, spirit. And Gandhi says that by education, he means an all round drawing out of the best in child and in man, right? Drawing out the best. So any education that only works on our mind is not according to Gandhi education. Education must draw out the best in terms of our mind, in terms of our body, in terms of our soul. So, in a sense, mental, physical, and spiritual. Now, Gandhi wrote extensively about education, but one particular moment in his life that is referred to again and again, and I just want to restrict myself to that, not in detail, but very, very, in a very abbreviated way, is the 1937 Vardha scheme, which is the basic national education or basic education or Nai Talim, as we refer to it. So Gandhi talked about a lot of things, and it led to a lot of, shall I say, it led to heated discussions as well. I mean, people like Zakir Hussain kind of ripped apart a couple of propositions that Gandhi had flagged. But Gandhi was essentially talking about a couple of things. So if I were to summarize the entire proceedings of the meeting, Gandhi was talking about a couple of things. Gandhi was, of course, talking about compulsory education. Gandhi always believed that education must be compulsory. Now, what would be in education is a different debate altogether, but education is compulsory. He never, ever said that education could also be something on the basis of, likes and willingness and inclination, etc. So compulsory education is something that Gandhi truly categorically subscribed to. The second thing that Gandhi was pointing out in his basic national education tenets was that, education for a child should enable him or her to produce. Right? He or she should be able to produce something. Right? Then the third thing, which is in a certain sense related to the second, is craft, craftsmanship as part of education. That children should be able to work on something, to build something. And this is not something that's happening in 1937. Remember, Gandhi is a man who is stubborn as hell. I mean, his stubbornness is absolutely peerless. Gandhi in the 1890s, when he was working, in South Africa, when he started the Tolstoy Form, later during his stay in South Africa, he was essentially, and in one of his letters, he's talked about it, that he learned shoemaking. The man knew how to make shoes. He learned shoemaking himself, and then he introduced shoemaking in his educational setup. He learned carpentry himself, and then he introduced carpentry for his children. So children were, of course, learning other stuff, but alongside they were in the kitchen, right? So that also Gandhi considered as a very important part of education. They were in the garden, they were doing gardening, they were learning carpentry, and they were learning shoemaking. And all of this was essentially part of education. Unlike, the kind of education that we have now, where we might have a PhD, but we really don't know, we can't differentiate a plant from another, which is hopelessly tragic in a certain sense. We don't know how to cook, and we don't know how to identify various plants, etc. And of course, forget all this, carpentry, etc. Just simply forget. So manual labor and the idea of touching, the idea of doing something with bare hands was very critical in Gandhian formulation on education. So craft was very central. And what was it that Gandhi was trying to pitch as a result of some of these important propositions? He was trying to make a case for an education that has a self-supporting aspect, an education that is enabling you to produce for yourself, to be able to sustain yourself, right? So for instance, Gandhi, and this is where Zakir Hussain had serious issues, Gandhi essentially in the Vardha scheme, he said that children should be able to put in some labor. right? So they will work on something and they will get money for that. And the teacher's salary will be as per the work that is put in by the children. And then Zakir Hussain said that, in due course, what we will see is the teachers will end up slaving children, right? Enslaving children. And this will essentially lead to child labor, etc. And Gandhi did take a note of that, but he was quite hell-bent upon this idea that, that education has to be self-supportive. And of course, goes without saying, education was meant to contribute to this cult of non-violence in the society. So and Gandhi genuinely believed that when people are meditatively focused on various things, when they're working with matter, when they are using different faculties of theirs, then what is happening is that a certain kind of temperament vis-a-vis non-violence is automatically generated. And he also believed that this would lead to education for democratic values. And by democratic values, Gandhi was essentially making a case for adjustment and education in adjustments. And Gandhi genuinely believed that in a country like India, in an alarmingly plural and stunningly multi-religious, multicultural country like India, an education in adjustments is very, very central, right? So if an education could help us, understand the virtues of adjusting, the virtues of tolerance, the virtues of patience, and in a certain sense, patience, I would say, then what happens is that it kind of paves the way for a very, very different sort of society. And lastly, he was quite clear that, he was against stuffing with ideas, that every now and then you're just bombarding the kids with new ideas, or, new chapters and new lessons. And he simply said that, this stuffing only happens because we are only occupied with the mental. So the teacher is obsessed with ensuring that the children or the child has learned something. And what does learning imply? That the child is able to repeat what the teacher has just said. So there is a fascinating text that some of you might be aware of, Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, one of the things that Freire talks about is narrative sickness, right? And he is essentially talking about this repetitive character of learning, that again and again it's the same thing. So Gandhi was way before Freire was talking about it, although in a much more profound way. Gandhi was talking about this fundamental with stuffing. So overall, now once we have these things in mind, how do we understand dialogue in this particular frame? Before I move on to Tagore, Gandhi was essentially, when I say education as dialogue, Gandhi was actually doing something quite phenomenal. He was doing something absolutely transformative. What we realize is that when Gandhi is making a case for learning by doing, Gandhi firstly is talking about dialogue between different faculties. So a dialogue between the mental and the physical, a dialogue between the physical and the spiritual, a dialogue between the mental and the spiritual, and so on and so forth. So the first thing is dialogue between different human faculties, right? That becomes a central aspect of Gandhian take on education. The other thing, which is perhaps more revolutionary, is that when Gandhi is writing, and we all know Gandhi's position on Varnashram system, on caste system, and Gandhi has been critiqued and he's been questioned for that position of his. Gandhi always defended the Varnashram system. We know very well that Gandhi was never ever to go against the Varnashram system. His debate with Ambedkar is well known. We know very well that Gandhi held on to his position, although Ambedkar was morally right and Gandhi was immoral as far as his position is concerned. But what is important is that, in the typical in a typical caste-driven society, there are people who are known as repositories of knowledge, and then there are people who are doing labor. So, for instance, if you were to think about the Brahmins and the Shudras and the untouchables, so there are few who are doing, there are few who are, who are seeking recourse to manual labor, and then there are few who know, right? So knowledge and work. Now, what Gandhi was doing as a result of, in his new education, whatever basic education, what Gandhi was trying to do was that bringing a certain kind of dialogue between these two sections of society. So when he was bringing together knowing and doing, he was also trying to bring at par those who are up in the caste system and those who are down in the caste system. And if you go back to, for instance, the early years of Jamia Millia Islamia University, in fact, there's a fascinating paper that's written by a good friend, Lawrence Gautier, who teaches at OP Jindal University, and I think it was published last year. You know, when if on Jamia as a national university, because Gandhi was so central to the overall conceptualization of this national university. In the early years, actually, students and teachers of Jamia used to go out and do manual work in surrounding areas, and this was part of university life. This was part of university life. You didn't just have to take your lessons. You didn't just have to teach, but you were also required to roam around, to take a stroll in nearby areas and do a bit of work. So gardening was done, a little bit of work with crafts was done, and they also assisted families that were around them. So some kind of a bringing together of manual labor and knowledge acquisition. In a certain sense, bringing together the Brahmins and the Shudras, and even the untouchables, because manual labor is something that is considered as not that dignified, and knowledge acquisition or knowledge imparting is considered as a fairly dignified walk of life. And Gandhi was, in a certain sense, of course, quite unsuccessfully, because it didn't really work that much. I mean, we are way more casteist than Gandhi thought we were. So it didn't really, he didn't succeed as much as he thought he would, but this is precisely what the idea was. So I think what it does is it informs us about dialogue in a very different way. Education as dialogue between faculties, various human faculties, and dialogue between different sections of society, a society that is tragically determined by the dictates of caste and ascriptive inequality, right? So this is Gandhi. Now let me move on to Tagore, and again, in about 15 to 20 minutes, I should be able to finish this. You know, Tagore is a very different individual. Although Gandhi and Tagore kind of come together on a couple of concerns. So for instance, when it comes to education in the medium of instruction, both Gandhi and Tagore are of the view that mother tongue is crucial. So medium of instruction has to be in the mother tongue. They're both there. They're both against rote learning. They're both against examinations. They're both against education being restricted to the mental. Right, so far so good. But there's a way in which Tagore kind of takes things a little away from what we've a little further. And Tagore is more metaphorical. Tagore is more poetic. Gandhi is more analytical, because Gandhi is, of course, working in the field. So Gandhi is more stubborn in terms of a set of ideas. Tagore is someone who's always, evolving and introducing new ideas. Now, and when we have to understand Tagore's take on education, once again, very briefly, we have to look at where exactly is Tagore rooted, because some of the principal concerns that Tagore has, I think, cannot be dissociated from what he points out when he's talking about education. Now, when I'm talking about Tagore, I'm primarily borrowing from some of his essays. So, for instance, a famous essay of his is My School. Then there is another important essay of his that is titled Religion of the Forest, A Poet's Religion, Creativity, the Collection Creativity, etc. So this is what my corpus is while as I talk about Tagore on education. But let me also flag that Tagore has written more than 100 pieces on education. The man actually wrote incessantly, and the man wrote a lot. I think they're very much rivals of each other. 100 volumes of Gandhi, more than 70 volumes of Tagore. So they wrote madly, with a maddening zeal. So I'm restricting myself to just a few of his essays. But to begin, we cannot talk about Tagore's views on education without looking at how did Tagore look at, in general, freedom, creativity, religiosity, etc. So, for instance, I'm reminded of a fascinating verse, of Tagore, and it's very, in a certain sense, it's very Upanishadic in terms of what it invokes. It tries to invoke. So, for instance, Tagore, in one of his poems, he says, "Not here, elsewhere." right? That's the line. Not here, elsewhere. Now, if you think about it, this is something that kind of informs us quite promisingly about what Tagore's overall philosophical trajectory has been about. Not here, elsewhere. So something that is always in the making, something that is always progressing. So Tagore, number one, Tagore is not someone who is writing about events, or he's not writing about outcomes in general. He is a man of processes. He is a man of journeys, right? Not here, because the moment you say here, it essentially marks the end of the journey. So he says not here, elsewhere. So you set out for something, you reach that particular destination, but then the next thing that occurs to you is not here, elsewhere. And you're constantly on the move, you're constantly progressing, you're constantly moving ahead. So this is the way in which we enter into Tagore's views on education. Conscious wandering, I want to put it this way. Conscious wandering with a so it is not just about wandering, because wandering can also suggest something negative, something that is unacceptable, inappropriate. But here we're talking about conscious wandering, right? With a meditative awareness, you're constantly moving forward, but you with a sense of, with a certain shall I say, loyalty, or with a certain allegiance to wandering. So here, Tagore, now to come. So this was the background. Tagore also believed that education has to be holistic, right? So they both agree. I think Tagore and Gandhi, they both agree on this position, on this point, that the colonial modern education, what it has done is it has simply attended to the mental. And Tagore believes that, education has to be holistic. It is something that should involve a certain, what should I say, a certain focus, a meditative focus on different faculties of the individual. Now, in this case, Tagore then is talking about education as dialogue in terms of a certain kind of synthesis that is happening between various faculties. So they talked about, as I pointed out earlier, that they both agree that medium of instruction needs to be the mother tongue. They both have serious issues with examination, although Tagore had to introduce examination in Shantiniketan, as you would know, because some of the kids who were enrolled there were kids of upper class elite families, and these families were financing Tagore's university experiment. And because these parents were quite clear that if you don't take exams, how the hell will we know what our kids are doing? So examinations are important to figure out what has been the overall progress. So Tagore eventually had to, and he was quite upset about it, but he couldn't do anything because he needed money. And without money, the university wouldn't have functioned. And the parents were hell-bent that you need to have examinations. So examinations were at one point of time introduced in the Shantiniketan. Tagore, but there is a certain difference between, before I move on to, one or two, three important aspects on Tagore's views on education. There's a certain difference between Tagore and Gandhi as well, because if you remember the non-cooperation movement, right, in the 20th century, Gandhi is very clear that we should essentially opt out. We should get out of these colleges and schools and universities that are funded by the British, that are English, that are colonial. Gandhi was very clear. And in fact, a lot of people also quit their jobs. If you remember Premchand, the extraordinary stalwart Hindi writer, Hindustani writer, he actually quit his job as a result of, Maulana Azad's speech that was delivered in Gorakhpur, and he was listening to that speech. So a lot of people actually said, Jayaprakash Narayan, for instance, he left his studies and he left Patna College and came to Delhi. But Tagore was not in favor of this. Tagore believed that there has to be a certain kind of confluence. Tagore believed in exchange. Tagore did not believe in separation. Tagore believed in some sort of meeting point. So the meeting point of the East, India is part of the East, and the West, right? And in this case, the colonial masters as well. So Tagore did believe in fusion of civilizations. Gandhi did not believe in this, because Gandhi was very clear that since the colonial powers enter the subcontinent with a certain power logic, even if you fuse the two, what we will have as a result, will have more of the West and much less of the East. So the fusion will not truly be fusion. It will be traces of the East and a predominant presence of the West. And in fact, not just and in fact, someone like I think Gandhi was also favored by someone like Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay, the famous Bengali writer, whose novel Devdas is much cited and talked about. Sarat Chandra Chattopadhyay, actually, he also critiqued Gandhi, critiqued Tagore. Tagore was writing in favor of education, and Sarat Chandra wrote that no, we have to oppose education because it is through education that colonialism is essentially furthering itself in the subcontinent. But anyways, now to come back to Tagore on education and how that can help us, make sense of education as dialogue. Tagore was always interested in the atmosphere. So, for instance, if you read his essay, My School, Tagore is quite clear that more than class teaching, more than lessons, more than these technicalities of education, he is more attentive to the atmosphere. So, for instance, an endless ground, trees, etc., where the children could just, the kids could just run like mad people. They could climb the trees, they could sit on the branches, they could relax under the tree, they could read as they are leaning against the trunk, etc., etc. And Tagore was of the opinion that the idea of education is not in knowing, but in being, right? So knowing and being are two different things, according to Tagore. And as he very famously pointed out in his essay, My School, he says that we have not come to the world to know it, but to accept it, right? So in acceptance, what happens is that a certain sense of harmony, a certain sense of harmonious being comes into existence. So not in knowing, but in being. Now, there are 2-3 things that I think are particularly crucial when it comes to Tagore's take on education and how that helps us understand education as dialogue. Tagore was quite clear about one thing, that education is about complete nourishment. It is not just about attending to the mental faculty of the child. It's about complete nourishment. For instance, he said that atmosphere is the most important aspect. And the example goes like this. So for instance, let's say you have to teach a child a tree, right? So you have to teach a child what a tree is. Now, there are 2 ways of going about it. One is, and this is exactly how it's done in schools across the country, unfortunately, even now, that you get a larger than life size poster of a tree, and you have each and every part of the tree that's marked, right? Or maybe different colors. If you become so creative, then you actually get different colors for different parts. So there is trunk, there is stem, roots, branches, leaves, flowers, and that's it. And what will the teacher do? The teacher has a ruler or a stick, and the teacher will point that what is it? And the kids would say, this is flower. What is it? These are leaves. What is it? These are branches. What is it? This is the trunk. What is it? These are the roots, and so on. And this is how a tree is taught. Now, very often what could also happen is that an art teacher, a drawing teacher, will become a little more excited, and he'll say, why don't you draw a tree? And all the kids, unfortunately, all the kids are going to draw a tree exactly the same way, right? So let's say there are 50 students, there are 30 students, and the art teacher has asked them to draw a tree. And it's quite surprising because, the fact of the matter is that children are way more imaginative than us adults. We are hopelessly, mechanized individuals. Nonetheless, a 5-year-old kid, a 6-year-old kid is actually drawing the tree the same way, right? Now, this is what happens when you are not providing complete nourishment to the child. So the tree has not really been actually conveyed to the child. Now, what Tagore is pointing out is that take the kids out in the garden, right? Take the kids out in the ground and let them run around like mad creatures. Let them go to the tree, hug the tree. Let them climb over the tree, lie down under the tree, touch the tree, feel the tree. And this is the way in which they begin to understand tree in a very different way. And once you introduce kids to the tree this way, then what happens is that they actually begin to see a connection between them and the tree. And this is the moment of dialogue, remember, right? Because dialogue is not just about teacher and student. Dialogue is also about something that happens between various manifestations of creation. So, tree is one manifestation of creation. The human being is another manifestation of creation. How is it? How is it possible that there are so many trees that are felled every now and then in the world, and we know it very well, yet nothing happens deep inside us, right? The only concern that we have is that we might not have paper, which is also a very instrumental concern. So, and what Tagore is pointing out is that if we truly were to introduce students to this kind of education, then perhaps the concern related to tree would be a very different concern. So then tree does not, so for instance, very often when people are talking about deforestation, what is the concern? The concern is, and they would simply go back to the early chemistry lessons, photosynthesis, right? That the tree actually gives us oxygen. Now let's assume for a moment that trees did not give us oxygen. Let's say that trees were just there. To hell with oxygen, carbon dioxide exchange. Now, would that imply that one could just shamelessly, brazenly cut down the forests? And this is where Tagore's instruction is quite phenomenal. He says that, trees are not to be only treated as a source of oxygen, or trees are only not to be looked at only from the vantage point of photosynthesis. There is more to a tree, right? Tree is not just about an oxygen supplier, because if you only think about oxygen supply, then the engagement with tree, the engagement with nature becomes very instrumental, very profit driven, right? Very mathematical, calculated. So education in that sense should lead to a dialogue, right? So for instance, those of you who do a bit of gardening, or know a little bit about gardening, you know, we think we think that gardening is just about watering the plants, but it doesn't really work that way. We should, as you know, as kids, when kids do gardening, they what they do is they hold the plant in their hands, they touch the plants, and then they water the plants. And as you touch the plant, and this is something that you can do whenever you want to, if you touch the plant and you spray water on the plant actually acquires life in a very different way, rather than a very mechanized everyday routine where you hold a gallon and you pour some water and then you move on to the next spot. But when you touch the flower and when you spray water on the flower, then there is something else that happens. And this is precisely what Tagore was, of course, Tagore was talking about interconnectedness, but I'm framing it as a certain kind of dialogue that happens, a certain kind of extension of being where you're opening yourself up. And as a result, what happens is that you begin to see a certain connection between something that is not necessarily a part of human, nonetheless has something to communicate, right? So this is something that, and Tagore was very clear about, particularly children, because he believed that, children are repositories of reckless curiosity, reckless curiosity. Children are always curious. And dialogue can only happen when their curiosity is not constrained. Because the moment you restrict their curiosity, the possibility of dialogue with other manifestations of creation will end, unfortunately. So what can happen is, for instance, one of the things that I found quite phenomenal, quite insightful, is that naming. So very often what happens is things are immediately named. Let's say you're walking with a child. You're walking with a child, and the child sees an insect, or the child sees butterfly, and the child is seeing this insect or the butterfly or this bird for the first time, right? For the first time. And the first thing that the child would ask you is, what's that? What is it? And, as an educated parent or as an educated elderly, what do? You immediately say, that's a butterfly. That's a ladybird. That's a grasshopper. And this is where education ends. We think we are educating, but we have done the damage. Because according to Tagore, and not just Tagore, but several other educationists as well, for instance, a great German education philosopher, Rudolf Steiner, he also said that naming is the problem. Don't name it. Let the child arrive at knowing the butterfly. And when the child arrives at knowing from a certain trajectory, then the butterfly becomes something else, because this is a very wrought way of learning. It's a very, very conventional, very, shall I say, very unimaginative, non-creative way. We think, so for instance, and this is something that you guys will also find quite hilarious, we think that if a 5-year-old can name all the insects, and a 5-year-old can name all the birds, and a 5-year-old can, recite 10 poems, we think the kid is educated and the kid is great. No, the kid is done. The kid is done and dusted. Because as far as these great educationists are concerned, kids actually need time to arrive at something. But once they arrive at something, that association remains lifelong. So, for instance, to go back to the example that I gave, when they are simply told it's a butterfly, their association with butterfly is of a different kind. But when they come to know the butterfly in their own ways, that is when a lifelong association with a different manifestation of creation begins to develop. Then the butterfly becomes something else. And that is the moment of dialogue, if I were to indulge a little. Uh, and lastly, he also says, and in fact, I mean, I can share the essay with Bezad, and then he can perhaps share this essay with you. My School, it's a fantastic piece. I think we all should read it as often as we can. He says that imagine a child who's sitting on the branch of a tree and generally reading, right? Now, some of us might think that the child, where should one read? One should actually read in a proper space. So, for instance, library, classroom, study, a particular space in the house that is dedicated, that is devoted, that is identified for studying, etc. Now, the branch of, and Tagore says that, when people point out that this is not how it should be done, Tagore says that we don't know that learning to climb on a tree is also education. How to climb a tree, according to Tagore, is a very important part of education. How to know how much weight you have to give where once you are on the tree, that's a part of education. Many of us are absolutely deprived of that education. And what's happening in that education? In that education, there is a moment of dialogue that's taking place, right? A dialogue with another version of creation. So, for instance, and Tagore very beautifully points this out. He says that, in Shantiniketan, as some of you would know, that they've had a tradition of walking barefoot, right? They always walk barefoot on the campus. And the idea is that when you're walking barefoot, there's a way in which you actually educate your feet, because your feet also need to have their education. So for instance, he says that many of my students can actually walk on a path that is full of thorns, yet their feet do not get pricked by these thorns, because their feet are educated. They have had their education. But for people like us who have always had footwear, and he says, I carry a thick soul of ignorance. That's a beautiful way of putting it. A slipper or a footwear has a thick soul of ignorance beneath the feet. He says, for those of us who've always had who've always walked with footwear, we will not be able to, we have actually deprived ourselves of a very, very important lesson in education, that how to connect with the earth. And walking barefoot on the earth, according to Tagore, is actually another way of connectedness. And to just to give you two examples, and then I'll end, because I think we need to have some time for discussion as well. you know when we think of these things as dialogue, one thing that comes back to my mind again and again is and this is something that I suppose, if I remember correctly, I pointed out in the earlier interaction as well, an expanded sense of self, right? That when we are able to rise above ourselves. So for instance, I'll give you two examples and these examples might help us understand how an education of this kind is actually a dialogue. So one example has to do with, so we were, our professor from JNU, when I was a PhD student, he had taken some of us to the mountains, and it was a lovely place, absolute wilderness. And I remember that we were walking towards a point that was called Sunset Point, right? This was a fairly well-known tourist spot, Sunset Point, where you could see the sun go down, and it was a absolute, the mountain range, and very golden and melancholic in a certain sense. So we were just sitting there, bunch of us, research scholars, MA students with our professor, and we were silently sitting and generally admiring the expanse of the nature. And suddenly, a set of students sort of entered. I wouldn't say students, but a bunch of set few guys. So they drove to that spot and they got out. And I distinctly remember the person who was driving. He said, "Guys, we have 5 minutes, and just click the photographs, and then we move. Uh, then we go." So, and this was a very educating experience in itself. That I mean, how do we? And these are all. Let's be very clear about this. They are very educated people. I mean, at least they were speaking English. So I'm assuming, as far as the modern reading of education or the modern perception of education goes, the commonsensical perception, they seemed educated. But the idea that you just don't have time for any of this. And I think on the same trip, I think in the morning, we were taking our breakfast in the hotel, and there was this group from Dehradun, and I think these were students from Doon School, and they had come for an excursion with the teacher. And one of the students was asking the others, "What is it that we are going to do today?" And this person said, "Same stuff, mountains." So the sheer boredom that was there, or the sheer lethargy with which this kid said that we will be taken to mountains again, absolute disenchantedness, right? So that connection has not taken place. So for instance, if you were to really sit before a sunset, and or I mean, anything in a desert or wherever, not just, I mean, even in the busy streets of the city, and just have a moment of pause and a moment of reflection, then it kind of leads to a sense of interconnectedness. It leads to a sense of dialogue, which is not necessarily the kind of dialogue that we talk about when we discuss policy interventions, conflict zones, etc. This is a very different kind of dialogue. It's a dialogue that has been pending for a long time. It's a dialogue between different faculties, and it's a dialogue between one manifestation of creation and another manifestation of creation. Let me give you the last example, I'll stop. So some of you might know this. I think about 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago, I don't exactly remember, but there was a news that Saturn and Jupiter were to be spotted in the sky, right? I don't know if you guys got to know about it, but and I also didn't know about it. A student of mine shared this news, and from 6:30 to 7, from 7 to 7:30, Saturn and Jupiter were to be spotted in the sky. This is what the news said. And they had also provided a map that if you're able to see the moon, then beneath the moon, this is this star, and a little right, this is this star, and a little up, it's Saturn, and a little up, it's Jupiter. So fair enough, I took my phone. So, and my student said that I might want to see this with my daughter, who's about 6 years old now. So I said, that's wonderful. Now, before 2020, this happened in 1683, right? Remember, the last time Saturn and Jupiter were spotted in the sky, where from people from Earth could see, this was in 1683. So this was, quite some time back. And next, they will be spotted in 2080, 2080. This is what the news said. Anyways, so my daughter, she was very excited because so far she has only seen Jupiter and Saturn in books, right? I mean, of course, it's impossible to see. And when I told her, she was mad with joy. So she said, "Let's." So we went to the rooftop. But of course, Delhi. I mean, that's where I stay. Now, Delhi is a hopeless city for all we know, and Delhi that day became even more hopeless because this was a weekday, and COVID lockdown, at least for a while, was was something that we really enjoyed. I shouldn't say this because, of course, a huge segment of India also suffered a big deal. But anyways, so traffic doesn't give a damn to Saturn, Jupiter. The city doesn't care. The city remains indifferent to these things. And we, for about half an hour, we banged our heads, but there was just no trace. I mean, thankfully, the moon was visible, and that's about it. And there was another star that was very, very, very faintly visible, and we couldn't spot Jupiter and Saturn. And it was 7:30. And my student messaged me that he could spot, he was in Jaipur, so he could spot Jupiter and Saturn. And I told my daughter that, in Jaipur, it's perhaps it seems it's visible in Jaipur. So she said that why are we not living in Jaipur? Why are we living in Delhi? And of course, it's very difficult to inform a 6 year old kid about why are we living where we are living, etc. But she said something that was, I think, that was very educative. And she said that Delhi is a terrible city. These were her words. Now, when she says Delhi is a terrible city, as a 6 year old kid, I think her understanding of the terribleness of Delhi is very different as compared to the way in which someone who's stuck in traffic jam says Delhi is a terrible city, right? So we are all always saying Delhi is a terrible city because we're stuck in traffic jam for an hour, half an hour, hour and a half, etc. But when this young kid, when she says Delhi is a terrible city, I think this is actually a moment of education in a very Tagorean sense, where she's able to see a connection between something that is so life affirming, cosmological, in a certain sense, revelation, and a very petty stuff that you're just not, I mean, something that is out there, but you're not able to see. And why are you not able to see? Because you live in a city that is awful. And the other thing is that let's assume for a moment that the state is invested in these things. Let's say that the Indian state were to do something about this spotting. So, some kind of some. I mean, I'm just pitching this idea. I know it will never happen. Whether it happens in 2080 or whenever the next Saturn and Jupiter, who cares about Saturn, Jupiter? But if the state were to invest, say for instance, today we will not have traffic, and some kind of observatories where kids could just go, or people could just go and see Saturn and Jupiter. What is it that it will do? So if you were to see Saturn, or if you were to see Jupiter, one thing that it would do is you would be instantly able to think about yourself as someone not in terms of national location, right? You will be able to see yourself as an inhabitant of a larger cosmos. And that is a moment of what many people said, a moment of expansion of self, right? You have to go beyond a provincial understanding of yourself, a Delhiite, an Indian, an Asian, a world citizen, all kinds of nonsense. The moment you're able to see Saturn or see Venus or see Mars, something that immediately happens is a certain kind of dialogue begins to take place with another manifestation of being, of creation. This is something that I suppose Tagore was insisting on, and Tagore was quite passionately pursuing. So all in all, what I wanted to point out, and I hope I've although I kind of I went in all directions, but I hope what I what I've done in the past hour and a quarter is that education, not necessarily as dialogue in terms of checking indoctrination in its tracks, but more importantly education as something that leads to dialogue in other walks of life. So whether it's Gandhi who's talking about education as a dialogue, as a possible dialogue between the upper caste and the lower caste, or it's Tagore who's talking about education as a possible dialogue between different faculties of the human being, and not necessarily a dialogue between teacher and student, but a dialogue that happens within the remote corners of our being. And as a result of that dialogue, we are able to see connections that exist between different manifestations of creation. Something that is so obvious, something that is so immediate, something that is so given, yet something that remains absolutely, absolutely unattended, right? Something that remains so far away, so distant, as far as the dynamics or the essentials of everyday life are concerned. So that will be all. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Irfanullah Farooqi, for this very fascinating talk. Now we open the floor for questions and answers or comments. Mushtaq, you want to go first?
Thank you, Dr. Farooqi, for a very enlightening session. My question is related to the educational policies of both Tagore and Gandhi, because both of them formulated the educational policies as you stated. They had a certain scheme of things in mind. Shanti Niketan was there. Then there were many schools based on Varda scheme. So, but pragmatically, why couldn't they become mainstream, or why Indian society or even Congress later on didn't adopt most of these measures? So why we witness that these education philosophies didn't become mainstream and were not somewhat pragmatic, though we talk about their merits off and on. So that's precisely my question.
Yeah, I mean, that is an important concern, and I wish I had attended to this concern during the talk itself. You see, specifically, for instance, if I mean, whether it's Gandhi or Tagore, one thing that could be immediately said in relation to the concern that you raised is that what they are pointing out, whatever they are flagging in the context of education specifically, is actually a subset of a broader vision of human society. So, for instance, let's say that that if we were to, so for instance, if we were to stick to Gandhi, right? So let's say we talk about what Gandhi has written in Basic Education, Nai Talim, the Vardha scheme proceedings. And if we were to think about what all was Gandhi was trying to pitch, and we were to go ahead with this, right? Whatever Gandhi has written, let's just go ahead and introduce all of this. But the larger society is dictated by very different terms and conditions. So if the larger society remains, let's say, city centric, the larger society does not consider village as the ultimate site of social life, the Indian social life. The larger city engages with agriculture as just another mode of livelihood. And the larger city refuses to think about colonialism, or let's say any kind of cultural invasion, as something that absolutely deteriorates social life or corrupts our life. Then what will happen is these things will, as is the case, will suddenly become outdated, or they will suddenly become a certain kind of aberration. So, for instance, what usually happens is that we are thinking. So we have a certain practice, right? So there are ashrams, or there are these interesting alternative experiments in schooling, but the dictates of the society are of a very different kind. So forget all this. Even, I mean, let's not even get into Gandhi, Tagore, etc. Even the example that I gave you about my professor. So what he would do very often is he would take us to mountains, he would take us to various places just to think about things slightly differently, and not an academic gathering at all. We were just discussing all kinds of interesting stuff. But one thing that we were repeatedly concerned about was that you have to go back to the city, you have to go back to JNU. And the university does not want you to remain in the mountains. The university does not really want you to go into the forest. The university wants you to attend to your studies a certain way. There are papers to be submitted, there are assignments to be written, there is an evaluation pending, and you have to search for job. And when you search for job, you cannot really talk about all this sunset sunrise nonsense, right? Nobody is interested in sunsets and sunrises. So that concern will always be there. And why is that concern there? And this is something that I told my professor repeatedly, that you've ruined us for life, because we speak a language that not many people understand. You've corrupted us, let's be very clear about it. But and the fear, the simple argument is that the rest of the society does not work along these lines of imagination. So for instance, and this is something that I've found so often, that you are walking on the road, and let's say you're walking with a close family member, let's say you're walking with your parents, right? Or you're walking with your brother, and you suddenly say, oh, look at the moon, right? Or the moon is absolutely, I mean, its splendor is beyond words. And there is just no response. There is no response whatsoever. They don't. So you can share the news that Saturn and Jupiter will be spotted tonight. Nobody gives a damn. I mean, let them be wherever they are. Who cares? Right? Now, in this kind of a setup, none of this might work, because end of the day, what they were pointing out was to be pitched in a setup which was geared towards a certain philosophy of life. So as when I started talking about Gandhi, something with which I started, I suppose, was, what kind of a human being do we cherish? So if we are cherishing a Gurgaon human being, no offense to, Gurgaon as a place, but, that typical, very instrumental rationality, if we are cherishing, Wall Street individuals or Manhattan human beings, World Bank individuals, then of course none of this will work. And in fact, it will be an absolute disaster, because if you were to train them the way Tagore wants you to train them, they will be outsiders. They will be, for all we know, worse than aliens. They will speak a language that, and suddenly what will people say? So for instance, if a 12-year-old kid talks about moon, talks about trees, then suddenly people would say, you've become too old, right? That's the only expression that we have. Because apparently only old people can reflect on trees, moon, sun, cosmos, death, existence. And it is not the forte of young individuals. So if a young kid is interested in all of these things, people would say, this is not the age. You work hard, become productive, get good education. Good education means an education that provides for you, good certificates, find a good job, get a good CV in place. And once you retire, you can do everything that you want to do in terms of gardening, kitchen stuff, hobbies. But these years are not to be wasted. So, but Gandhi and Tagore were, of course, not looking at this. They didn't have, for instance, I'm reminded of a fascinating phrase by Tagore. He says, life is not to be understood in terms of addition. Life is a process of synthesis. It's not addition. Because if we get into counting, then we are done. Then everything becomes an addition in your CV, right? The most meaningful thing will be deprived of its meaning. Because end of the day, we are into CV building, right? Everything becomes a bullet in your CV. That's a tragedy. So Tagore and Gandhi were looking at a very non-instrumental, broader understanding of activity. So for instance, when you're running and you're climbing a tree, there's nothing instrumental about it. You are just in the moment, and a certain kind of dialogue is happening between you and the tree. Now, of course, none of this will happen in any of this, because the schools are, what are the schools doing? The schools are actually driven, they are defined, and in a certain sense, they are constrained by the dictates of the market. The market does not want individuals to talk about Saturn and Jupiter. That will be horrible, right? The market does not want you to be working and talking about the splendor of the moon, right? The charm of the full moon or the crescent or whatever, anything, the silence of the night. It could be anything. If you are a romantic of the kind Tagore would want you to be, then you will find romance in everything, right? You will speak, your commentary on the world will be of a very different nature. And suddenly people would say that you are not speaking of your age. You are someone who is in his late 40s or early 50s. This is not something that you say when you are in your 20s. Why? Because the market, the dominant players of the world have. So I suppose it has, I wouldn't say it has failed, but it has lost out on its appeal, and it unfortunately is not dominant in the educational matrix of the world in which we live, because the world actually swears by a very different logic of life, of productivity, right? So take for example the case of productivity. Forget creativity, for instance. Even creativity, and maybe I've already discussed this, even creativity is understood in terms of what you produce. So let's say Mushtaq Sahib is a good poet, right? And you write poems once in a while. And let's say you've written an extraordinary poem and you've shown it to me, and I'm absolutely spellbound. And then you write another poem 2 weeks down the line and you send it to me, and I'm like, wow, this is even better. And then suddenly you are silent. You're not able to write any poem. What will I do? I will become concerned about you, because I want you to write a poem every goddamn day. But that's not how it works. And if you've stopped writing if you've stopped writing poems, it doesn't mean you've stopped being creative. But what has the market told us? The market has told us about a quantified understanding of creativity, that those who are creative are always writing poems, whether they are mediocre, absurd, third rate, but you have to write. So Insta poetry, Facebook poetry, everything will be stuffed into the larger corpus of creative arts. And we are all writing incessantly. For all we know, books might be out in 3 days. But end of the day, we know creativity is a slow process. It takes time, right? It requires a certain pause, a moment of reflection, meditation, contemplation. And and we all know that there are long phases of silence, right? Great writers remain silent for years, and then they wrote something phenomenal, and then they wrote something terrible. But that's the way it is, the lows and the highs and the lows. But market would always want you to have to exhibit a certain graph, right? So I think that's the reason why it didn't work out, because whatever they pointed out, it doesn't really work in the larger scheme of things, which is, and I think because it didn't work out, there's a certain nostalgia for that. Why is it that I'm talking about it? Because when I read Tagore's views on education and religiosity and freedom, I deeply realize that this is so phenomenal. And I sincerely, feel horrible that, my schooling was nothing of that sort. And maybe most of us didn't have that kind of schooling. So there is this nostalgia, there's this feeling of being wronged in a certain sense. You also feel your parents accountable for the sheer loss and wastage of those 12 years of schooling in that sense. So this is what I can tentatively say.
Thank you.
Baligh?
Right, sir. Thank you, Dr. Farooqi, for your enlightening lecture. So I just wanted to ask you a question of how do you draw a parallel between or the similarities between the new education policy and what Gandhi said about learning by doing?
Uh, See the new education, so the 2021, right? The 2020, the
Yes,
national
sir.
education. Okay. See the new education policy. I mean, if we, in fact, it so happened that I was one of the persons to actually comment on the issues with the draft of the new education policy this year as well as in 2016, if I remember correctly. There was another, the Subramaniam, T.S. Subramaniam, the education policy. So, as many scholars have pointed out, and I've particularly found Professor Satish Deshpande's, reflection on the education policy very poignant, very discerning, that it's too good to be true as a document, right? I mean, Indians have become, very charmingly pessimistic, shall I say. So it's too good to be true. So for instance, the insistence, I mean, there are things that it talks about where we see a certain Gandhian, uh, shall I say, inclination or a certain allegiance to what Gandhi was pointing out in basic education. For instance, the mother tongue insistence, the idea of vocational training, for instance, that is also something that's enshrined. But as many scholars have pointed out, academics who are invested in education, for instance, people like, I just pointed out Satish Deshpande, people like Krishna Kumar, there's another fellow from Department of Education, Delhi University. I'm not able to remember her name. She's a fascinating scholar. As they, Anita Desai, no, not Anita Desai. Anita Desai is Anita Rampal. Sorry, yes, Anita Rampal. So what they have pointed out is that much of it does not really talk about how are you going to bring about these interesting interventions. And the concern pretty much is akin to what I was just saying to Mushtaq, that we all know, people who are working in the field of education know very well that schooling and higher education are in a certain sense determined by the broader forces of the society in which we live. And our concerns around privatization, our concerns around curriculum, our concerns around, education as becoming a very instrumental value in itself, have to do with our concerns with the larger mood of life, right? So people who are writing, I wouldn't say writing against national education policy, but pointing out the flaws, are simply pointing this out, that if you do not attend to the broader policies of society, right, a certain, this surging aspiration vis-a-vis privatization, whatever doesn't work, privatize, whatever doesn't work, give it away, whatever doesn't work, rolling back of the state, etc., etc. So this is something that I think scholars are pointing out. But as we all know, all these people, whether you talk about 2020 or you talk about 2016, names are always dropped. 2016 was full of Aurobindo, Vivekanand, Gandhi, and Tagore. But I don't think any of the writers had extensively read what these people had to say about how education is to be carried out, particularly in a country like India, in a multicultural society like India. Similarly, here as well, the aspirations are remarkable. I think it's a very intelligent, and it's a lucidly written document. Let me put it this way. I mean, if you read other previous documents on education policy, I think this one is definitely the best in terms of its prose, in terms of its flow, in terms of its structure. And it also attends to some of the concerns. For instance, it doesn't go into attending to liberal education, liberal arts education, etc., and talks about incentivizing liberal arts education. But it does not talk about how is the market going to be brought into favor of something like vocational education, or in liberal arts education, etc. So a lot of people, so even say for instance, let's say mother tongue, right? A lot of people have talked about the fact that where is the literature in mother tongue, right? I mean, they don't talk about who's going to translate. If do we really have credible reading sources in the mother tongue? Do we really have visually appealing textbooks? I mean, the only experiment that was done by Eklavya when the tribal education project was carried out in the late 90s, early 2000. I mean, they did stunningly great work in terms of, not compromising on the language part. Not politicizing the language part, just introducing tribals through stunning visuals. And then NCRT, when Krishna Kumar was the director, NCRT under the National Curriculum Framework, they also brought in, very interesting cartoons. One of the cartoons also led to a serious controversy, the Nehru Ambedkar cartoon. But they did a bit of that. But I mean, as far as the overall schooling curriculum is concerned, it's absolute blank. So the concern is obvious. So as far as what should I say? As far as the references are concerned, as far as citations are concerned, it's all fine. I think they do talk about, the document does talk about something that we find in the, like, not just Gandhi, but to a certain extent, Krishnamurti, Tagore, Vivekananda, etc. But we really don't know how will it get carried out. I mean, how will it be carried out? Which is why Professor Deshpande very rightly pointed out towards the end of his essay. I think it was published in Scroll or on Hindu, I don't exactly remember, but he writes towards the end that as a policy document, it is too good to be true, right? So, because it just talks about everything so beautifully that suddenly as an intellectual, you become a little skeptical, right? If everything is talked about so, in such a lovely way, then you realize that there's something fishy about it. So that's what I would say. And in any case, I think all policy, see, Gandhi, one of the problems with Gandhi is that he's been museumized, right? I mean, I think just the man who's just been referred to, but nobody, of course, a very controversial figure. I'm sure we are all aware of Gandhi's incredibly controversial reading of sexuality, of caste, of even labor. But the man remains significant for a variety of reasons, right? I mean, one cannot really dismiss him. But the state always, uses Gandhi or Tagore or any of these luminaries in a very weird way. It's like you can consume them without changing your life. It's a very convenient consumption, right, of Gandhi, of Tagore. So let's not get bothered about what they had to say. Let us just have smaraks and bhavans and roads and margs, and that will do. So I think it's a very typical state way of appropriating, making use of great figures, luminaries. And it's very unfortunate because that's not how one should engage with our past luminaries.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Sabiha More.
Good evening, Irfan sir. It was nice to see you again and learn from you. I think we share the same podium. I'm also a teacher educator for last 30 years. And every time you spoke about the nuances that education has made, I was just getting a coy smile thinking that we see it every day in our life, how education has become more meaningless than meaningful. I don't want to comment on anything, but I want to tell those who are here that those who wish to follow Gandhi, there is still Wardha University, there is still Vedchi University, there is still Krishnamurti's school, Rishi Valley School. You can go and give your students or your children that kind of education where in Rishi Valley, there is no timetable. The child decides that today, if I want to study mathematics, he will open his book, he will solve a sum, and then he will go to his teacher saying that I did not understand this. Please make me understand. Or if he feels that while going to the class of a maths, he feels like playing a flute, he's been given the freedom to play a flute. The problem is, as you said, that the world has become so, sorry, sir, to say, but the colonialism never went away.
Yes.
The English went.
Yes.
The colonialism is still there. It is Bill Gates who decide what should we read. It is Mark Zuckerberg who decide what kind of education we will take. It is probably Chinese authorities who decide what kind of factory-made workers we will have. Ek zamane mein probably some other lord would have decided. Today, China decides what kind of fitter and mechanics do you want. So the whole education system is driven market. And if you want to be in the market, then you have to be, I'm sorry to use that word, it's a very cheap word, then you have to be a chalta purza, where you are fitted anywhere and everywhere. But if you want to really be a class apart, then go to Shanti Niketan. I have been to Bolpur and I've seen how beautifully still in that glass bhavan, you still see people sitting under a tree and studying. But then how will you celebrate Rose Day, and how will you celebrate Chocolate Day, and how will you celebrate Traditional Day? So it depends upon how you bring your child, one thing. So I want to say that there are still schools, there are still people who give the way of Tagore and Gandhi. The only thing is there are no seekers. And when there are no seekers, it doesn't get multiplied, one thing. And second, I want to make an observation, sir, that I have mentored a child who was dyslexic from age 3 to age 17. He was there for me for good 14 years. I just want to quickly just share one anecdote. So when Anushak, his name, he was highly dyslexic, absolutely gone case, getting beaten every day by parents and school saying that you are a lazy bum, you don't want to write, your spellings are horrible. So he came to me and took him under my tutelage, and we used to have a very gala. Still, I'm very close to him. So once in 5th standard, I was teaching him Jainism and Buddhism. So I just told him that, oh, Jainism is a very strict religion. And then, you know what happens? Jain people give a lot of pain to their body. Like they walk barefooted, they don't eat for days together, they pluck their hair to become a monk. So he said, why? So I said, because they said that this is the way they will meet God, Nirvana, he will have it. So for a second he was quiet, and then he told me, मेरे को तो नहीं मिले भगवान आज तक. मैंने बोला क्यों, ऐसे क्यों बोल रहा है? बोलता कितना पेन देते हैं ना मम्मी और टीचर मेरे बॉडी को, लेकिन अभी तक मुझे भगवान नहीं मिले. I'm been pained. So as you said, children do get meaning of the new words. For him, Nirvana was getting beaten every day by parents and teachers. So if you give a child the freedom to think, they're pretty creative. And he asked me also one day, why do the birds make nest? I said, because they want to lay eggs. So how come they know? I said, they know. So he told me, then it should be other way. Man should not be the most intelligent animal. Birds should be most intelligent because they know exactly when they're going to lay the egg. So you understand that if you give a chance to think to your children, then and when you don't try to make a fun of the dialogue that they make, then learning and education becomes a very fruitful process, which all the schools fail to recognize. This is what I'm trying to tell you. This is what my observation was. Thank you so much for reiterating the faith that what education today we are seeing in the market is all hopeless. Ultimately, we'll come back to basics, maybe 10 years later than now, or 20 years later than now. Thank you so much, Professor Irfanullah. Thank you very much.
Do you want to add something to it, Dr. Farooqi, or?
Well, I just I mean, I think this was a very assuring addition, but I think one thing that, in addition to absolutely agreeing to what ma'am has pointed out, I think one thing that also remains to be, we need to be mindful of is that these platforms, whether it's Rishi Valley or Shanti Niketan, or there are many, for instance, in Delhi, you have Waldorf, which is borrowing from the writings, from the ideas of Rudolf Steiner, the German educationist I spoke about. What remains kind of a little unsettling is that they remain alternative sites of education. So I've been to several counseling sessions because I was thinking I did not send my daughter to any school, so she's homeschooled. Of course, she's not homeschooled; she's just not doing anything. But I think homeschooling is about not doing anything and just sort of extending your childhood by a couple of years. So, I mean, I never had the privilege, so I thought I might as well do something about it for my daughter. So she didn't go to any school, but at one point of time, we of course got a bit concerned because she was also, getting a little wild, as it were, just way too wilder than what Tagore thought kids would be without textbooks and teachers. So we started attending some of these sessions, and particularly Waldorf, a very very interesting thing. But one thing that we, of course, me and my wife, we've been exposed to a certain literature, so we've read all these people, and we've, thanks to few professors in JNU and a few courses that I mean I did, and I hope she's also done. I think we kind of became a little self-reflexive, right? So we knew where we were wrong as students in college, in university, in schools, and how our curiosity was mercilessly, shall I say, was mercilessly suppressed. And but we went to these sessions, and there are some, say, 30 odd parents, and I see every parent as absolutely clueless, because the parent cannot understand how can it work without an examination. Because end of the day, you have to know what, I mean, if you're paying 10,000 a month or 5,000 a month, one thing that you definitely want to know is how much has your kid, your ward, your son, daughter has learned. And learning is again a very quantifiable thing, unfortunately. So there has to be a card, there has to be a report card that says average, satisfactory, below satisfactory, above satisfactory, excellent, outstanding, all of that. I mean, something which we carried all our lives, right? I mean, I carried above average, satisfactory throughout my life. All the report cards were pretty much photocopies of each other. So parents are very concerned. So we were not concerned. But even in alternative schooling, I mean, if we were to speak to the people who are there in the administration, I'm sure for them it's a tough time, because these parents are, one thing that they're very concerned about is that if their kid is not able to do what the world wants them to do, then what will they do? Because already 10 years gone. So this is because it remains an alternative thing. So I suppose parents remain concerned nonetheless, but you're absolutely right that if we are really invested, if you really want an emancipated learner, a fearless, curious student in our kids, then I think there are platforms. Of course, in big cities, there are platforms. I don't think in towns and villages we have these opportunities, unfortunately. I mean, towns and villages offer their own sites of education. And Shanti Niketan, you very rightly pointed out, it's a fantastic.
Sir, I want to introduce this group to a lovely book called Bin Shikshakanchi Shada. This is written in Marathi, Without Teachers School. There are 21 schools in Maharashtra who function on a very non-conformist this thing. The only problem with this book is that it is entirely in Marathi. You have given me a chance to translate it into English and bring it to the larger audience, probably. Yeah. So you understand that in smaller villages also people have started this, a different school, not a conventional one, something which is very, very, alternative, as you say. It's not alternative, it is the via one, not the, it is deviated from the normal. So there are many, many schools. If you try to look, even in, since I stay in Bombay and I'm in Maharashtra, I know about this. And I'm sure everywhere else also there will be many, many schools. And we must, popularize those schools. Given a chance, I would like to again send my children to school. They are grown up now. There is no need for, but if given a chance, I would like to send my grandchildren to a school which is non-conformist. We don't want, मेरे को नहीं चाहिए कि वो 60% लाए, मुझे चाहिए कि वो मेरे यहाँ के खेती करे. I will be very happy. अपने आम उगाए, अपनी चीकू उगाए, that will be very nice. But ऐसा होता नहीं है. The problem is that. So thank you very much for again igniting a fire that I'll translate this Marathi book into English with the concern of the author and present it to a larger audience. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Finally, Nitya.
Yes, good evening, sir. Thank you so very much for your lecture. It was a sheer delight listening to you. And I have one sort of reflection and another question. And I really want to take this opportunity to ask the second question, though it is a bit out of the context. So the first question is, when we talk about Gandhi and Tagore, somewhere the focus seems to be so much about bringing ourselves in touch with the whole idea of freedom. So maybe for Gandhi, it was more embedded in the realm of morality, through really understanding through our own self and in relation to the other. And for Tagore, it was more about the expansion, like towards the cosmic realm, that relating. So both somewhere are, that's how I understand, are bringing us back to the whole to the notion of freedom in order to learn, in order to understand. But what we see in our education system is that there is seemingly something very threatening and scary about the whole notion of freedom, because our entire educational system is so Skinnerian, like the psychologist. It's based on reward and punishment, in about quantifying whatever we study and making it so instrumental. So, sir, what do you think is so scary and threatening about, making sense of our own freedom in relation to others, of course? And so my second question is a bit out of context, but like I said, I want to take this opportunity to enhance my own understanding about Martin Buber, where you said that, we need to allow ourselves to be met. So going back to the whole notion of I, it, and I and thou, I think that is one thing I don't know, I don't understand it, but I know it. So if you can help us, simply just to sort of like explain it to us, that how do we practice that or internalize the Buber's notion of dialogue? Yeah, thank you very much, sir.
Okay, so I'll stick to the sequence. Although the second one is out of syllabus, but I'll I'll give it a shot. Um, so I mean, in relation to the idea of freedom, I think there's something that we very often miss out on, and I suppose we miss out on because it's not a comforting realization. The fact of the matter is that we are individuals who are temperamentally not free, although we think that we must have freedom all around. And I go back to a famous essay that was written by us, essay which was titled "Spirit of Freedom" by Tagore in 1905, when the Swadeshi movement had emerged, and it was a very, very important moment in the history of colonial India. And Tagore was simply pointing out, and I think there was something very phenomenal, quite prophetic about what he was pointing out. He said that those who are free create freedom around them, right? Now, if I am free, then according to Tagore, I should be able to create, a landscape of freedom, a culture of freedom, a world of freedom all around me. Now, if I'm not allowing freedom, then the fact of the matter is that I am not free myself. And this could be applied to parents and children. So, for instance, when parents stop their children from things that are not necessarily hazardous or dangerous or fatal, then I think what they are essentially doing is they're creating a culture of non-freedom, right? They're contributing to a culture of non-freedom. Broadly speaking, we live in a world where non-freedom is incentivized. So for instance, when I say that so and so should be banned, right? What is it that I am essentially hinting at? I am essentially hinting at my deep allegiance to a culture of non-freedom. When a lot of people in India say that, enough of this democracy nonsense, we should actually have a dictator, right? We should have army rule. And all kinds of aspirations are doing the rounds, by the way. What is it? I mean, we want to be controlled, right? There's a way in which governmentality becomes the expression of the state. We want surveillance all around us because there is so much distrust of the other that we are absolutely not able to invest in relationships, in acquaintances, in friendships. So with a lot of distrust, with this very peculiar take on the stranger, the unfamiliar, and this, of course, all of this has direct repercussions on the possibilities of dialogue in our society. As a result, what happens is freedom is not something that is to be found. And I'm not talking about freedom in terms of, freedom of expression or freedom to think. But I think deep down, we are all unfortunately, we are all proponents of unfreedom deep down. Because if we were truly free, then I think we would have created a culture of freedom around us. And the simple reason for that is that even as an activist, when we are making a case for freedom, we are not able to understand freedom and interconnectedness in a broader sense, right? So, for instance, the kind of interconnectedness that Tagore was drawing our attention to, I don't think even the most staunch activists have that sense of interconnectedness. So, in their own lives, they might perpetuate unfreedom in several walks, right? But of course, and this is not to go against activism. I'm all for activism and hardcore campus politics, or democratic aspirations, dissent, etc. But what I'm trying to point out is something that is way subtler, right? Much more nuanced, that deep down we nurture unfreedom. And I think that is something that can be thought about when we look at the larger mood or the larger temperament of our society. For instance, think of this idea of interconnectedness or an expanded sense of being, as you were pointing out. Tagore, in one of his songs, he says that I know, and it's a beautiful song. It's a beautiful poem, actually. I know, my prayers for life that haven't been answered have not been lost. Right? These are the words. Now, this is such a remarkable expression of an expanded self. I know, my prayers for life that have not been answered have not been lost. Similarly, when he says that I touch God through my songs, the way a mountain touches the distant sea through its stream. Now, such a phenomenal expression of an expanded self, interconnectedness. I mean, when you look at the mountain and when you look at the sea, nowhere can you, there's no possible way of entertaining the idea that the sea and the mountain are actually connected to each other, right? But it is only to a great perceptive, discerning mind like Tagore's, they are connected, and they are very much connected. The mountain actually connects the sea with the sea through its stream, right? So I think that the freedom bit is not just about an identified set of targets, that the regime, the leaders, the dictators, the despots, etc. I think it's a larger malaise, right? It's a larger malaise that unfortunately plagues our society. I think most of us, in various capacities, at various moments of our life, we nurture unfreedom, and deep down we also like unfreedom. We might not be conscious of it, but there are moments when we desperately want that, when we want someone to be silenced, when we want someone to be censored, when we want someone to be kicked out of the room, etc., etc. So there is that aspect, because true freedom is truly liberating. It creates a sense of fearlessness. So again, to go back to Tagore, where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, that's a state of that's a state of an enchanting sense of freedom. So that's what I would say, that perhaps this is how we can make sense of this lack of freedom or absence of freedom in educational institutions. I think it's more to do with us, and I think more self-reflection can perhaps serve as a remedy. As far as Buber's I and thou and I and it are concerned, uh, Buber was someone who was very much, I think I'm sure Professor Pathak has talked about him, because Pathak remains an ardent admirer of Buber, and I take pride in the fact that we've had numerous conversations on Buber. So Buber is essentially, so for instance, something that I just referred to, seeming and being. Buber says that the modern conditions of existence is such that even in our interaction with the other remains a thing. It, right? That's the word that he uses. And and why does the other remain a thing? Because I am going by the seeming. I'm not going by the being. I'm projecting myself as someone in any conversation, in any exchange. So therefore, it remains, for the most part, according to Buber, it remains an I and it relationship. Now, when can this I and it relationship transform itself into I and thou? It can only happen when I am willing to let myself known. And that will not happen as long as the seeming bit preponderates, right? The seeming bit outweighs the being bit. So it has to be a moment of, in that sense, a moment of vulnerability, where you, as I said earlier as well, that, it's very difficult to be open to be known, right? In how many relationships, in how many exchanges, in how many situations of, conversation and exchange are we genuinely, as it were, not guarded, right? And I think one of the things that's said about love, not just in terms of romantic love, but love as an overarching sentiment, is that it provides a sense of carelessness, right? It generates a sentiment of fearlessness, that you can just take off your guards and you are open before the other person, the person, and you're open to be known, and that leads to a very different moment. And this, according to Buber, is the I and thou interface, where the other person, because you have opened yourself up, and the initiation has to be from your end, you have opened yourself up, you have agreed to be met. To go back to what he wrote about dialogue, when you accept to be met by someone. So now the person meets you, not the seeming but the being. Now the person meets you, and that honesty, that sincerity, and that trust that you've reposed in the other leads to a new relationship, or let's say leads to a new turn, or leads to a new development in that exchange, which is from I and it to I and thou. So suddenly the person ceases to be a thing. Suddenly your relationship with the person ceases to be merely instrumental or one that is calculated. It becomes more life affirming, it becomes more meaningful, it becomes more faith giving, because there's so much trust and faith that you've reposed in that. So you open yourself up first. You are willing to be known, which is not an easy thing. I think we are always guarded. We are always very careful and conscious about that. We don't want to be known. We are always projecting ourselves as someone else. We are always wearing different hats. There's a fascinating text by a great sociologist, philosopher, Erving Goffman, which is titled The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, where Goffman essentially says that we are always enacting. There are these stage appearances. We always have an audience in mind. We are always projecting a certain self. And there is a backstage life. So there is an on-stage appearance and there is a backstage life. And this is precisely what in 1925 Buber was saying, that there is seeming and there is being. And any attempt at dialogue has to be prefaced by, doing away with seeming, getting into being. So, and when he talks about education, he says teacher has to do away with seeming. I mean, if you're seeming like someone, you can't really create that possibility in education. So you have to be who you are, and only then your students will invest in what you have to say. Then there is trust, then there is faith, then there is affection, and then there is a very genuine understanding. So this is something that is about I and thou, which is essentially predicated on extreme reciprocity and sincere faith towards mutual growth and learning. That's what I can say.
Thank you so much, sir. Yeah.
All right. So with this, we come to the end of today's session. Thank you so much, Dr. Irfanullah Farooqi.